Hello, hello. Right, okay. My name's Simon Jones. The last 5 years I spent a year in Canada growing ganja in big warehouses for legally. And we had two separate warehouses, each with about 20,000 plants in. And we started out in soil and then switched over to hydro, primarily dripper systems. Then I spent just under a year in Colorado working on an edibles business, and there was a huge change in the legislation there, so I had to jump ship. So I jumped ship and I was in Jamaica for 3 years. Firstly, in the middle of the island in Santa Cruz, in an area called St. Elizabeth, which is probably the primary ganja growing area in Jamaica, allied with Westmoreland, which is over on the west side, which is where Negril is and where Orange Hill is, for people who are into it. Okay, can I just check you can hear okay at the back? Is that all right, sound? All right. Right. This is in St. Elizabeth, in the middle of Jamaica on the south side. Oh. Oh dear. Any ideas? Am I missing something? That's good. Brilliant. Yeah, sound. Is it easier if I use the clicker or use this? Doesn't matter? No. Okay. Right. And up here, you can see a radio mast, and just about half a mile past there is where I lived for about a year. And it was great living up there, because that's on top of, that's about 3,000 foot up. And for anybody who's been to Jamaica, it's seriously hot. So living on a 3,000 foot mountain is good, especially if you come from North Wales, where it's windy and wet. And that's what you're used to. So that was good. Okay. Now, there's a couple of things. Firstly, this is in an area called Kashmir, and this is in Jamaica, which you wouldn't really expect. But in the 1850s, 1855 or so, a load of indentured Indian workers came over to work in the cane fields after the days of slavery, and they brought bags of ganja seeds with them. So behind, if you kind of look to the left here, there's about 50 square miles of a wetland morass area. And if you've seen any of the Strain Hunters video, or the Strain Hunter video on Jamaica, the very end of it is people who grow in a swamp and make mud islands. Right, that's here. That's just about 2 miles away. And so there's a huge wetland morass here. And that's really, this area is where all the Indians originally were based. So there's an area in the bottom of the valley called Slipe. And others lived up on the hills, which is why this area is called Kashmir. So, a couple of things here. Firstly, in terms of medical ganja, whether you're in North America or Jamaica, for example, at the moment, this is medical ganja. So it's kind of field of ganja, and people have a spliff or whatever and self-medicate. But what there isn't is any standardization, yeah? Because in Jamaica, people are growing from seeds the whole time. They're not using clones. So every single plant in that field will be a different plant, yeah? And in terms of making standardized medical oil, you've got no chance. Can't be done. And what's happened is, and we'll look at it in a bit, is that where people miss the males in the field, they then pollinate the females, so all the genetics gets mixed together. So the second day I was in Jamaica, I went down to the morass area, and one of the crews down in the swamp had just cropped, and they had 10 big bin bags of ganja, dried out, ready to sell. And I pulled out the first plant, and it was OG Kush. And I thought, 10 bags of kush, wow, okay. I put the second plant out, and it was a kind of lemon haze. Then the next one was a blueberry. So I went through the whole of the first bag, and I had about 10 different piles of what were sort of phenotypes. But even there, they were different. So you've got a field of ganja, but in terms of standardized product, no chance. And if we go, I mean, the thing is, if you've got a headache, you go to the pharmacy and you ask for paracetamol. Each tablet is 500 milligrams, and you know to take 2 tablets every 6 hours. That's the way it works. Doesn't apply. It just doesn't apply to this. And this is where we've got to move forward. And it's a lot easier here, where we're growing from clones, than it is in Jamaica, where everything's based on seeds. Yeah? So that's perhaps the first thing to say. The other thing here is, you can see the soil is bright red. And in lots of developing countries, the best soil is thought to be the red soil. And it is, if you feed it. But what people do here, and I was quite surprised, is the amount of artificial fertilizers that people are using is truly scary. So this is grown, this field's all grown under artificial fertilizers. And it's a huge shame, because there's enough organic stuff to hand that's just not being used. Anyway, so that's the distinction I'm making here, is between what's growing out there and a standardized product, which is what medical patients need. Okay, this is a seed breeding area. So, and this is a breeder who is actually called Indian. And I met him, I was doing voluntary work as the technical director of the St. Elizabeth Ganja Growers Association. And he turned up to one of the meetings with packets from, I think, Skunk One, Blue Cheese, DJ Short Blueberry, and one of the Cushes. And so I went back up to the farm, and this is his seed breeding area. And the thing is, the strains aren't being kept separate, they're all together. So what was a pure skunk genetic isn't anymore. And this is one of the key things. Now, after they've got the seeds, they'll put them into these as normal. So you've got your seed trays there, and you'll see them just in little clumps, and they actually plant them out like that. Oops. Right, now, this is a mate of mine, Russ Belleville, and he lives up on top of a mountain in St. Elizabeth. And you can see the way it works here, in that it's just pure slash and burn. So if you're looking at this from a carbon footprint point of view, because some of the buyers in places like Denver now are starting to ask for what they call eco-ganja. So is it sustainably grown? Are there ethical trading issues? Well, in terms of the carbon footprint, if you're growing indoors, you've got a lot of lights, a lot of aircon, a lot of artificial fertilizers, so you've got quite a large carbon hit. Growing outdoor, and this is why the study was really designed, was to try and show that Jamaican ganja was economically more sustainable than growing indoors. But this is the bad bit of the carbon footprint, and that's how people clear the land, and it's just slash and burn. Yeah. And what we're doing at the moment is trying to look at the different types of vegetation, and we're looking at 6 different types, and what's the carbon hit if that type of land is slash and burned, so we can actually do it rigorously. But just to show you here, there's a little patch in there where plants are growing, and I'll show you that in a minute. But that's where Ascani lives, on top of a hill. And this is the plants planted out. So they go from the seed trays into a little bunch like that. And you can see from the soil here, this is very heavy limestone. So this is not good soil. And on the east side of Jamaica, it's volcanic. And on the west side of Jamaica, it's limestone. So the east side of the island has in effect come up as a volcano, and the rest's come out of the sea. So there's a huge amount of volcanic rock there. And this is terrible soil. And they plant that many simply because some of those will be males. In fact, all of them could be males. Yeah, you don't know. And that's this little patch I showed you by Rascani's house. And you can see the little indentations in the soil where the ganja's been planted. And in the hills, that's kind of standard. This is not... One of the academics at the place I'm working with in the UK saw some of the pictures out here in Jamaica and was stunned how irregular the fields were. because in the UK and Europe, everything happens in little boxes. It's a box called a field, then there's a road, then there's a house, then there's another box called a field. Here, people just clear whatever land's available and just blend it into the landscape, partly because it's the only land they've got, and partly because it makes it harder for the police to spot them by helicopters. Yeah. And this is the plant a little bit further along, and here. And you see, even here, you can see the irregular plants. So some taller ones over there and some more shorter ones over here. And also that he's not bothered moving the trees or the rocks and the walls. He's just planted around them all. This is going back to Kashmir again, and you can see up on the hill where Jamaica's making a huge push towards wind power. So that's what they are, and the whole ridge is lined with them. And these are the fields just below. Now, for anybody who's grown ganja indoors, you're used to perhaps plants about 5 foot tall, nice and fat, nice heavy-duty buds. And this is a kind of standard field in Jamaica where the plants are often quite spindly. And it's partly a mix of the seeds being so variable, and partly because for people who grow, when you start off the veg stage, you want 18 hours of blue wavelength light to get the plants to grow tall. And when you want them to bud, you put 12 hours of red wavelength light and the plants bush out. In Jamaica, it varies between 11 hours in December and 13 hours in the summer, and that's it. So if you put the seed in and you plant them out, you tend to have these tiny little short plants that are like autoflowers in that they start flowering straight away. Yeah, absolutely. And you end up with these tiny little plants. And, you know, this is somebody's livelihood here, and the yields are all appallingly bad. So we've been trying to get him to move over away from seeds and switch to tissue culture, which is something I've been trying to set up with the University of West Indies. But, you know, I mean, I'm sure we all have this idea of these lush forests of Jamaican ganja, and that's the reality. Yeah, and it's partly to do with bad seed genetics. It's partly to grow with grow practices, and it's partly to do with its 12 hours of light, pretty much. And one of the interesting things has been where Jamaicans have been deported from the US for growing ganja in the US. And they're the ones who've come back to Jamaica with the latest technology and knowledge about how to grow. So what they tend to do, and I know a few people around the island, and they've all come back or been deported from the US. They've brought seeds back with them or got them sent down, and they grow indoors for the 18-hour first phase and then plant them out afterwards. Then you get good yields, but it's only a certain subset that are doing that. And ironically, as I say, the ones that have been deported from the States. Absolutely. Yeah. Yes, and what my friend N here is saying that, I mean, one of the issues in Jamaica is, see, if we as a grower in the UK or Europe or North America want to find out something, we can ask friends, or we can read soft secrets, or we can look on the internet, or we can come here. If you're a Jamaican subsistence farmer, that knowledge isn't there. You do what your dad does, and that's it, because you have no access to any other information. And what my friend here was saying was that some of the people coming back from America have been able to show their family who stayed locally the new growing techniques, but people are still very wary about it. I had a rasta and I was trying to get him to switch from artificial fertilizer across to using cow, goat, bat guano. And he said, oh yeah, I hear you, but I still want to use a bit of fertilizer, because that's what he was used to using. Yeah. So there's a huge cultural thing, but that's the end result anyway. That's a slightly better field. But you can see how uneven it is. You can see how poor the soil is. And that's what they're fighting against. This is quite a nice one in that he's got some nice plants going around. And that farm in total is about 12 acres overall. That's one of Indian's friends. And he's got water tanks up there and drip irrigation and everything else. So he's got a good crop, and that's grown organically as well. And what he found was switching from inorganic to organic actually upped his yield. And the customers who were normally buying perhaps 10 or 20 kilos from him were just wanting everything he had because it tasted so much better. But it took him a while to kind of buy into it. And this was the farmer with the cheese seeds. And what was her name? One of the Marley family needed a farm to film at, one of their videos. So it was filmed at this farm. But about a month later, the farmer rang me up and said, oh, can I go up and have a look? And all his plants were burned. And that's because he'd over-fertilised. You normally use 6 bags of fertiliser per acre. And he'd done that, and they were fine. Then he'd panicked and put another 12 bags in and just burnt the soil. And so we can't plant on that at all. So into the soil. So what I suggested was putting tyres on the surface and then putting clean soil into the tyres and growing in the tyres. So he wasn't actually growing in the soil that he'd managed to poison. And that seems to be working really well. But that was a bit of a kind of a improvised style. Yeah, absolutely. And this is down in Kashmir again. And again, it's just the variability you see in the plants. There's no consistency at all. And those will probably be a lot of Kush strains and a lot of Haze strains, but just all mixed in together. That's another one. And this again is up in Kashmir. And here you can just about see there. That's a strip of Ganja plants, just melded in. And that's the way that they keep the helicopters off, because you can't spot them from a helicopter if it's done like that. And this is one of the big issues we're starting to look at, is drying. It's really simple. How many commercial plants with a turnover of a few billion a year don't we actually know a consistent drying method for? And Ganja. Because if you're in India, Pakistan, Morocco, you chop the whole plant down and put it in the sun, simply because you're cropping a whole hillside at a time, and there is nowhere indoors. So in Morocco, etc., chop plant down, put outside. In Jamaica, chop whole plant down, then dry it indoors. Then put it out in the sun to crisp up, to make the trimming easier. As opposed to in Europe, where you trim off the whole plant, the live plant, and you only dry the buds. Now, I've not seen any science anywhere that says what's the difference, because we're always told, don't keep THC plants away from the sun. And yet, if you're drying your whole crop in the sun, what's the effect? So this is a trial I've been trying to organise for pushing a year at the moment. And hopefully I found a Home Office licence in the UK that we can do the trial under. But that's a current one, because it just seems stupid considering the size of the product industry that we don't know really basic stuff, like what's the best way to dry it? Or if you dry it a different way, what's the effect on it? And we don't know. And that's Ras Khani, and he's got his plants down at the bottom and he's just trimming them off. He was sat there for I think about 3 days, solid, cutting his Ganja buds. Now, this is in Kingston, and that rather innocuous-looking greenhouse is the indoor grow space that's legal for the University of West Indies. They've got a development and trial licence that lets, for example, my mate, the professor, he's got a piece of paper from the police that lets him carry around up to 10 kilos of ganja or up to 100 plants legally. So if he gets stopped, out comes this kind of get out of jail card. And this is one of his main grow centres. So in there, you've got that. And all you need from legal terms is to put this little bit up, experimental research material. And then behind that door is all these. And these are all a mix of Jamaican landrace strains and other Caribbean ones, primarily from Dominican Republic. And that's, in fact, one of the Dominican Republic landrace strains growing outdoors. So, I mean, for people who grow indoors, you know, you try and keep your plants fairly short, mainly because you've got constricted grow areas and you need to get your light down into the plants. These are primed, well, we'll see the size now, hang on, there. And that's Dr. Michel Emmanuel, who's one of my co-conspirators at University of West Indies. And he's about 6'4" or 5. So you can see how tall the plant is. And all the way, there's a row of them and along the back. And it's just the kind of legal trial area for growing stuff out. And whenever I'd have a bad day, I'd always just wander along there because it used to make me smile. They're just gorgeous plants. So, hang on a second. I'm just going to take a coffee for a second. Okay, what I'll look at now is this. In 2015, it was the spring, so this is 2.5 years ago now. Jamaican Parliament passed the Dangerous Drugs Amendment Act, blah, 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 blah. Right. What that means in practical terms is, well, I should step back very quickly. When I was living in the country, I knew about half a dozen people who'd been caught with one spliff under the old rules, which was a mandatory 1-year sentence. So one spliff, 1 year in prison, right across the board. And that means you can't get travel into the States because your visa's blown up. You can't get any public assistance in Jamaica because you're a criminal. You can't get public housing. And if you're a student, you can't get access to student loans. So it really, really messes things up. And now you see people walking along the streets with spliffs in their mouths. There was a building site near where I was living. They all had spliffs in their mouths. The only thing you don't do is smoke in front of a policeman. Okay, that's where you draw the line. Not that the policeman can actually do anything, because if you get caught with a more than your 2 ounces, they give you a ticket, and it's a $500 fine. And $500 is about £3. Yeah? Now, the only slight fly in the ointment from the police's point of view is they haven't been issued with the tickets. So 2.5 years after the legislation, the Ministry of Justice still hasn't released the tickets. And I was asking the Minister of Justice about it, and he just laughed. And he said, no, what we're trying to do is get the police to think a different way. Not just put out tickets, engage with people and work with people. And it seems to be working. It really has quietened things down. And the other thing under the law is that anybody who was caught previously with less than 2 ounces has their record expunged. And it's done automatically if you apply for a visa or you apply for stuff. And they're up to about 3,500 people so far that have had the records expunged. So it's made a huge difference. Okay, the new act's administered by the Cannabis Licensing Authority. And it says with representatives from government, academia, business and grower associations. Bit of a misnomer. There's only one grower on the CLA, and that's Russ Belleville from Westmoreland. And all the government and business people, none of the academics and business people have ever grown ganja in their lives. And you can tell it from the legislation and the way the system's been set up. It's been almost as if they've imported the rules from North America without actually realising that Jamaica's a different place. Oh, hang on. And this bit here, the DDA offers an opportunity to enfranchise small subsistence farmers. Well, all the early meetings I went to, the government ministers were saying one of the whole points of the Act was to make sure that the small farmers, who were the ones who'd borne the brunt of all the police action, were actually allowed to grow legally. But as we'll see in a bit, although the fees that the small farmers are charged to set up the licence are quite small, they also need things like a 6-foot security fence around the fields. And that's $1.5 million Jamaican, which is 10,000 US. So none of them have got that. They have to send in a weekly report to the CLA, Cannabis Licensing Authority. Well, these people who won't have bank accounts, a huge number won't read or write, and they definitely can't send a report in every week as they're required to do to the CLA. It just won't work like that. So there's been very little take-up, as we'll see in a minute. And the other point is the government to derive new revenue income streams based on license fees. Well, whether it's in Canada or North America or Jamaica, it's never said that the reason for introducing a medical ganja scheme is for health reasons. Nobody's ever said that. In Canada, it's ballot initiatives, and in the US, it's legal stuff. And in Jamaica, it's to improve economic conditions. Nobody has ever said this is to make the health of our country better. It's just a kind of interesting digression. And the study I did, the first study I did, was just interviewing ganja farmers growing illegally, which was the first time that had been done. And it was asking them what they did and how ready they were for the new legislation. And the background was there was a couple of studies in America, and they looked at college students, and the growers there grew indoors. They were white, middle class, and college educated, and really stopped growing when they did other things like got a job or got married or got into a serious relationship. And that was the reason that they stopped. And contact with the growers was going through government and grower association conference meetings in Kingston and a mix of people that I knew. And 2015, and it was from St. Elizabeth, blah, blah, blah. And some of the people knew each other, and they'd known each other from people I knew in London, and other people were all different networks. Okay, the study found, and remember that the American studies were all white, middle class, college educated. This study, all the farmers grew outdoors, all were Afro-Caribbean, all were male, all were working class subsistence farmers, all were school as opposed to college educated, all grew to make money, all accepted the risk of detection, all had grown throughout their lives, and all were full-time professionals. So this is completely different demographic to the American growers and a lot of European growers. It's also found, despite extensive, and the media coverage in Jamaica has actually been quite positive generally for the medical ganja. So that was quite interesting. But despite all the positive media coverage, for the reasons I've just said, like filling in forms, none of the farmers, what you'd get is just, Babylon system, I'm not signing up. And they just wouldn't do it. So there's very little engagement with the farmers. And we're seeing large differences in the degree of readiness between the farmers. Some of the farmers are already growing out 15 acres. They're growing ultra professionally. They've got full-time staff who live on the land. They've got security. They've got good genetics. They've got foreign customers who pay top rate. What do they want to join a scheme for? They're quite happy as they are. And they certainly don't want to report on it to the government. And the other interesting thing was, in the study I did ask people, are you paying the police management fees? And the numbers that came back were so big that I didn't report the numbers, because we're looking at possibly a minimum of 30% of crop value. Yeah, 30% of crop value goes to the police to keep them from chopping your crop down. And this is money that you need under your bed before your crop comes in. So when the police turn up, you've got the cash to give them. You can't say, come back in a couple of weeks when I've cropped it. It's got to be there ready. And in some cases, you're looking at the equivalent of about £10,000 sterling that had to be kept in cash ready for the police. But I didn't report on that at all in the study, obviously, because I lived there. Study also found that the studies grow from seeds, not clones, so it's very variable. All kept seeds from the previous crops, so what diluted genetics you had become even more diluted in the next generation. Some had their own seed beds, and some bought in seeds from sort of friends or contacts on the other side of the island. And 5,000, just multiplied by 6, so 5,000 Jamaicans, about 30 quid. So it's not a huge amount of money, but the genetics that you bring in can be appallingly bad. Most used artificial fertilizers and pesticides. Some used organic. And the cassava leaf tea is a good one, because you just get cut up cassava leaves, put them in a barrel. A week later you come back and it's pure nitrogen. It's brilliant stuff, and it's free, and hardly anybody used it. Cow, chicken and goat dung, pretty standard. Bat guano, they call it rat bat. Now, for anybody who's seen the SARS virus thing, they thought it came from bats in, was it Singapore? So if you are using the bat guano, you have to put it on a zinc sheet and burn it off, but very few farmers do. And one of the dangers, if you're smoking that local Jamaican ganja, that there's all sorts of spores on it that you don't know about. And that is actually a serious problem. And one farmer who runs a seafood restaurant used crushed lobster and crab shells and chopped seaweed as fertilizers. But even farmers, I was trying to say to the farmers, you grow Irish potatoes, what We call potatoes, they're Irish potatoes, to differentiate from sweet potatoes. And in Ireland, where they grew Irish potatoes, they used seaweed back in the day before artificials arrived. And no, they weren't having that at all. That was a real shock. And some were using compost, but not many, to be perfectly honest. It was quite a shock. I was expecting more. But some are using pesticides, including neem oil. And neem oil and Scotch bonnet peppers make a great spray, but very few people were doing it. Yeah, they're using artificials again. And market price ex-grower. I mean, you can actually get Jamaican ganja for about £6 sterling per pound weight. But that pound weight will have seeds on and stalks, because that's how it's sold. They're not on the bud. Personally, something about 5,000, so about 30 a pound, is really nice, right? And there's a grade also about 10,000 that's called entertainer weed, because it's only the Jamaican entertainers can afford it, yeah. And the 25,000 is the export price, and the 25,000 there is like 120, 130 quid a pound, and that will be blueberry, fruity juice, won't have much seed in it, won't have much stalk in it, and it's gorgeous. And that's from Orange Hill, that one. Right, almost done. And some produced a byproduct gum type of charas, so kind of from rubbing the plants. And for anybody who grows as well, when we were in Canada, we'd always use blue plastic gloves when we were touching the plants. And then at the end of the day, put them off and put them in the freezer, and keep a separate pile for each strain that you're doing. And then every Friday night we'd go to the freezer and crack one strain, and you just crush the gloves and the charas just drops off. And single strain blueberry, DJ Short, the bollocks, it's fantastic. I'd never tried it before. So anyway, they don't do that there. And none made hash or ganja oil. And ganja oil is obviously one of the main products in the medical market. So I was trying, and more are doing it now, and more are making edibles, but not that many. So all I'm saying here is that farmers need more information and advice, because they're just being left on their own at the moment. And if you've got growers coming in from Colorado and Canada, you know, it's hard to compete against that on the scale and the genetics. And the last bit, and a new post-harvest supply chain, including testing. Getting your ganja tested in Jamaica is virtually impossible, even though there are 2 testing facilities. An integrated approach, and we're saying you should have low-cost loans for the farmers, ganja parks. So those are kind of shared facilities for the farmers. So that's going to be things like shared water tanks and drip irrigation and security fences. Providing standardized disease-free clones. And as I say, we were working on tissue culture for farmers. A testing and certification system, just nowhere near yet. Training and extension. RADA, which is the training people, they sit at their offices and they drive around in nice jeeps. And the farmers don't know about crop rotation. They're not given any help at all. So no help at all coming there. And like in Colorado, the financial institutions can't take ganja money. And unless that changes, the industry will not move forward. And we've just done a questionnaire to Jamaican doctors saying, okay, you're the people who are prescribing. What do you know about it? And the answer is nothing, absolutely nothing. And they're scared, and they're due to start prescribing soon. And the other thing is, in Jamaica, there's a lot of church-going people. So one of the questions we put in the questionnaire was, do you think there's a risk of moral aberration with the clinical use of ganja? And e.g. laziness and sin. And the answer from about half of them is yes. So we're dealing with a lot of issues here, okay? And that's it, I think. I'll finish there, hang on a second. And these are grow licenses that are available. And what sort? Tier 1, 1 acre, 1 to 5, over 5 acres. How much does it cost? Quite a low initial cost, and your security bonds, annual fee. But the problem is 6-foot security fence, 10,000 US. Thanks very much. Cheers. Thank you.
Hi, next up we're going to have a UK policy panel discussion with some added help from some American friends. Obviously, cannabis legalization is moving across the world. It's global at the moment, and there's a lot we can learn from guys that are doing it a little bit faster than us over in the US. But it's nice to take note of what is actually happening here in the UK right now. some people say, well, not a lot's changing, but if you were trying to do this kind of event 5 years ago, I wouldn't have thought you'd be able to do it. I know you wouldn't have been able to do it. People were too scared to even say they used cannabis back then. So we're going to have Neil Woods again on stage, Russ Belleville from the Marijuana Agenda, Jonathan Liebling from the United Patients Alliance, and Stuart Harper from the UK CSC. We will start with Russ Belleville from the US.
All right. Welcome and thank you so much for having me here. My name is Russ Belleville. You might find me online as Radical Russ on everything. Twitter, Facebook, Pinterest, YouTube, SoundCloud, probably MySpace. I don't know, does MySpace still exist? But yeah, I'm here from Portland, Oregon in the United States of America. That's on the West Coast, north of California, south of Washington, right there in the sweet spot where it's beautiful and green and lush and wet. And, of course, part of the legal states that we have now. Oregon was legal in 2014. We followed the 2012 legalization in Colorado and Washington. We joined Alaska in 2014. And this most recent election, 2016, we got 4 out of 5 states that voted for legalization and passed it. The only state to fail was Arizona, and that was a 48-52 split, so not too bad. Pretty close in Arizona. So now we have the 8 states of California, Nevada, Washington, Oregon, Alaska, Massachusetts, Maine, and Colorado. And later on today, I'll be delivering a presentation that gives you a look at what's happened in those 5 years since 2012 in these states that have legalized, because we've got actual data from the states. We've got the state governments themselves telling us what the results have been. So I'll get to that in that presentation. For this presentation, for this panel having to do with policy, I hope I can just answer questions that people might have on what's happening in the United States and maybe offer commentary on what the UK may do moving forward as I hear from these other gentlemen that are here to discuss it. But I'd also like to make sure that I give effusive praise and thanks to Greg DeHoot back here from UK Cannabis Social Clubs. Please give him a huge round of applause. Because I was involved, the reason I'm here, it's such a tale of how just talking about cannabis and talking about reform can make such a difference. I was NORML's podcaster. NORML is the U.S. organization, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, the oldest marijuana lobby in the United States, and I was their podcaster. So basically that means you sit in a room in front of a microphone and you record yourself talking. And it's very lonely. You don't know that anybody cares, right? Because you record it and you send it out onto the internet like a message in a bottle, if you will. And from that, Greg had heard me, across the pond, as it were. And he was struggling trying to find relief for his conditions that he deals with medically, and frustrated that, the UK was so far behind and nobody was doing anything. And he heard my voice talking about reform, talking about legalization. And that inspired him, and he moved on to come to the States, and I got to meet him in the States in 2011. It was such a different kid, and I can say kid because I'm older. Such a different kid when I first met him back in 2011, because he'd been struggling and with the NHS and hospitals and having to do pharmaceuticals and stuff. He was a weak, sickly guy. 4 months in the United States, going to 4 different medical cannabis states, getting access to real medicine. It was like, Captain America. It was like he'd bulked up, man. He was all healthy and glowing and happy. And they came back here to the UK and decided to go on with the UK Cannabis Social Clubs and fight for some sort of freedom and some sort of reform here in the UK. And now, 6 years later, here I am, because he listened to me talking about it. And the point I want to make about that is you have that same influence. You have a sphere of influence of people that you know that just by being honest about your cannabis use or honest about your thoughts for reform. I know a lot of people live in situations with your job or the law where you'd be reticent to talk about it, or the culture is going to put you down. But there's all sorts of little ways that you can stand up for cannabis reform. You can dispel stereotypes. If someone says something, disparaging about cannabis users, you can say, well, I heard it's really helping people in Colorado. You know, that's not even you saying that you use it or that it should be legal. It's just introducing that element of doubt in their little hardline mental picture of what cannabis and cannabis users are. And the more you do that, the more you find it's easier, and you find the little cracks and the little openings in which you can talk about this issue, and you start to introduce it to people as being something other than what they've perceived it to be. So if I've learned anything from doing my podcasting and talking about it, it's like what I spoke about back in 2009 helped to affect this to happen is a miracle to me. And I know those miracles can happen in the UK, and throughout your family and friends and your work coworkers, we can make a change for the better. So I hope I can help contribute any way I can and with whatever I know. Thank you so much.
Hi, everybody. Hello. Hi, everybody. I'm Stuart Harper, the Political Liaison Officer for the UK CFC. Fine. And basically, I'm here today to tell you a little bit about the UK CSC and to give you an idea on where the UK currently is with its drugs policy in regards to cannabis and where we're going to be looking at in the next few years. But to kind of give you a little bit of an impression, the same as Russ, I've been in cannabis activism now probably a little bit shorter than Greg. And I'm also a medical user, but the way I come into it, it was about communication as well, and I think that's quite important to discuss about communication. So mine was actually with the Home Office. So what I was doing at the time was trying to get a Schengen certificate, which I'm happy to talk about in detail for anyone who wants to speak about it, but effectively what it lets you do is move cannabinoid medications around Europe. And I got into a detailed conversation with the Home Office, and I remember the first time I actually walked through the doors, and I wasn't part of any organisation when I did that. I just did it off my back as an activist because I was interested in changing the laws for everybody. And I had a very, very interesting discussion with the head of drug licensing. I had a very interesting discussion with a number of the scientists and regulatory officers that work there, and that kind of inspired me to talk to other people and to talk about things like the hypocrisy that, you know, I could be an Irish national that lives in London and I can bring medication from Europe into England and consume it legally in a police station, asking the officer to give me the space in anywhere, one of their offices, to smoke freely. Yet if I'm a British citizen, I can't even go abroad and access that same medication. It's a real duality that I found kind of hit home for me. And as a result, I got involved with numerous UK organisations, and now I predominantly work for the UK CSC. And as you guys probably are all aware, we are the regulatory body for the cannabis clubs up and down the country. So any cannabis club that wants to make sure that what they're doing is the least harmful, the least illegal, and needs help and support to be able to grow both their membership and their knowledge of cannabis, then we try to encourage them to join the UK CSC, to follow the rules and regulations that we've had assessed through various legal bodies and lawyers. And in that way, what we try to do is to make sure that people have got medical and recreational access to cannabis up and down the country, but supplied for themselves in their own community. So like Russ and the other guys, hopefully I'll be able to shed some light on the current policy here in the UK.
Hi everyone, I'm Neil Woods from Leap UK. If you want to know more about us, we've got a booth just over there. Come and say hello afterwards. I'm an ex-undercover police officer, and the rest of Leap are also law enforcement. We've got a couple of other members in the audience. And basically we campaign to regulate all drugs, not just cannabis, to take the power away from organised crime, and for human rights as well. You know, we shouldn't be interfering with people's personal choices, and it's a health issue, not a criminal one. As for the situation with cannabis in the UK, I think actually the most important thing in the political situation in the UK over the last few years has been nothing to do with top-end politicians. It's actually been to do with the police, because the most forward, the biggest development has actually been within the constabularies and within the police and crime commissioners. You've probably heard of Ron Hogg, who has basically declared a de facto decriminalisation, that he would not be pursuing cannabis. Derbyshire followed suit, Surrey did as well, and Ron Hogg is actually on an advisory board for Leap UK. Now what we're doing, one of the most important things we're doing at Leap, is to encourage police to follow that philosophy that drugs are a health issue. And change is happening faster within the police than it is actually politically. I went to meet with the Police and Crime Commissioner for North Wales only just less than a year ago, and he's now a member of Leap UK. He speaks regularly for us, and he gets loads of support from his constituents who voted him in, and lots of support from his local press. He's a serving police and crime commissioner. He's an ex-chief superintendent. So these are where the changes are coming. And so I hope that's with support from everybody, that's where it will continue to grow. Because there's two sides to this social movement, I think. There's the social movement within police, trying to change police attitudes, but also, you know, we meet a lot of politicians. I meet loads of them. I meet politicians, special advisors. Lots of MPs will say behind the scenes that they support reform, but they're scared of doing so, which means that the important movement is the social movement. And the social movement is basically every single person that agrees that we need to regulate all drugs. You've got to persuade everyone else, because it's each individual's responsibility to help grow the social movement. And you can certainly do that by following and supporting Leap UK on the social media, and definitely please listen to and share the podcast. Thank you.
Hello. I'm John Liebling. I'm the political director of United Patients Alliance. I'm not going to go into an awful lot about what United Patients Alliance are. I'd hope you know that by now. If you don't, we've got a booth up there, and you can find out all about the support we do for patients, and then some of the other work that we do. And as political director, a lot of people do look at me as a politician. I'm absolutely not. I got into this because I kind of had a perfect life at the time, or my entry into activism started. I was an IT director. I'd spent most of my time defending IT departments to retailers who all think it's shit. And then my life was perfect. I was earning about 80 grand a year, and I had, I had a bonus that took me above the 100. Living the life of Riley, you might say. That was right up until that my grow got busted, because the only way I'd ever been able to do that fucking job is because I'd been medicating for absolutely every day of my life up to then. But the thing is that job had taught me something. That job had taught me how to deal with arrogant, offensive people who just want to lie in your face and tell you, till you're blue in the face, that what you're saying is not true. And for some reason, that works really well. That skill works really well when I'm talking to politicians. And so if I can just put something in perspective, most of the politicians I meet, afterwards I really do have to go and have a shower. It really is, that is how it feels. But I have learned to speak their language. I have learned to talk in their language and how to talk to them. So sometime last year, and it's just to tell you a little story of where we got to and about a couple of events that are coming up. Last year we got Baroness Molly Meacher, who we've now nicknamed Medical Molly. She's incredibly focused on getting legal access to cannabis for patients. And she's been helping out ever since she came to one of our events. At the time, she knew that maybe there were some multiple sclerosis patients that might be helped with cannabis. So she was interested in the subject. After she left and she heard the testimony from a Crohn's patient and a fibromyalgia patient and a cancer patient and an MS patient and an epilepsy patient, she was absolutely blown away and immediately said, Jesus Christ, something's got to be done about this now. And fairly soon after that, we managed to produce a patient survey. Professor Mike Barnes, who's a top UK consultant neurologist, was able to produce the best report on medical efficacy that exists anywhere in the world. Obviously, we're still struggling to get that published, but that's kind of happening. And what it meant was we were able to deliver some evidence to number 10 Downing Street that the Prime Minister had to respond to. Well, I probably don't have to ask anybody in the room what the response was. You could probably give it back word for word, because that's the only thing they ever say in response. But it was never going to happen as one thing alone. It was always part of a plan. And that plan is beginning to come to another part of its fruition. You may have heard, and I hope you did, that Paul Flynn MP, in a drugs discussion a little while ago, a few weeks ago, in fact, in Parliament, and so it's there in record, you can go and see it in Hansard, he called on medical cannabis patients from around this country to come and break the law outside of Parliament, and he would support it. Now, an MP doesn't do this. There was nobody in his team, there was nobody in that room who was expecting him to publicly call for patients to come and break the law. So our first reaction is, please, everybody who's a patient, or else, actually, everybody, come out on October the 10th. Paul Flynn is raising a medical cannabis bill. But linking that back into the work the UPA are doing, so we're helping with that protest, and obviously we want patients at the front. But also, we're about to announce, and publicly this will be the end of the month, so you're getting a bit of advanced information, but we will be able to announce 3 serving MPs joining our organisation as direct supporters. And they're not from the same party. I can't announce any more details than that. Other than one, Paul Flynn is one of them who's going to join our organisation. We've also got Professor Mike Barnes, a consultant of neurology, who is also going to join our organisation. And if you have a look on our website, the medical information that is there is either written by him or it's signed off by him. And that's kind of what we're about. That's the direction we're going in. And what we want now is for everybody within the community to support this event on October the 10th, because it will be a good one. It will get an awful lot of fuss. And it looks like Paul Flynn is going to be out there on the lawn with us having some medicated tea and biscuits.
Well, I'm thinking, since these gentlemen are experts on the UK policy and I am not, perhaps my best role would be to facilitate questions and answers, and I'd like to get some from the audience, but I had one in particular for Neil. He's with Leap UK. I'm good friends with another Neil Franklin, who is the founder of Leap, co-founder of what was Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, which is now Law Enforcement Action Partnership in the United States, and it's taking on a broader role for all law enforcement. And I just had a question for you, because in the United States, 2 of the primary driving factors for law enforcement's support of the drug war, I believe, are racism and money. Number one, we have a vastly racist enforcement of our drug laws, and marijuana provides an easy way to rough up communities of color and to stop and frisk and all those things. And number 2, we have the phenomenon of asset forfeiture, where the cops can steal the money. In fact, in America, last year, cops stole more money than robbers did because of asset forfeiture. Are those factors in the UK?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first one, racism is a massive, massive part. If you are black in the UK and you're stood in the witness box waiting to be sentenced for a drug crime, you are 13 times more likely to be sent to prison than a white person, which should be headline news. It should be. We should all be protesting about that. If you're black, you're 6 times more likely to be stop search for drugs. So yeah, it's about racism, and yet, I've never known a cop who would actually admit to being racist, and they would be offended by saying, "Well, you're racist." And I could speak to cops right across the country, and they would be very, very offended. But the evidence is there. You cannot argue with the evidence. It's not just the police, it's the courts, it's the judges. So yeah, it's true, of course, that there are other racist elements to policing. There are differences for other arrests as well. But the differences for drug offences are dramatically worse. Dramatically. So the drug war in the UK and the USA and everywhere is a racist war. We should face up to that, and we should be doing something about it. As for the asset forfeiture, I am very pleased to say that we don't have anywhere near the same problem. In fact, we don't really have that in terms of a hands-on kind of seizure. However, there is a great political move to try and bring in more of that kind of thing. And we do have asset forfeiture as to a degree where financial seizures are made, but in the UK, it actually costs more to put those through the courts than we actually seize, because our criminals are fantastic at hiding money. Well, they are anywhere, really. I mean, in fact, if we ever in the USA and the UK, if we ever actually got good at seizing the money from organised crime, all that would happen is the price of gold would go up. You cannot take money from organised crime for drugs. You're just chasing your tail. So, but thankfully, we're not at the state that you are.
Oh, thank you for that. Do we have any questions from the audience? Yes.
I have a question for John Liebling of the UPA. In your delivery just now, you said that the UPA is basically heading down the medical prescription route, and that you'll be working with doctors. You know where I'm going with this, don't you? I imagine that quite a few of your members and advocate people are growers, and I'm wondering how you feel about the right to grow.
I feel about as strongly about the right to grow as every single person at this festival does, and so do UPA. And in fact, that was one of the reasons. So often the difficulty is, if you want to get invited to sit around a table, is you sometimes have to accept things that you don't want to accept. And you've got to make a decision. Do I want to influence these people and therefore get invited to sit around a table? Or do I stand by what it is I believe in and not get involved in the conversation? And if I can just describe how we manage that specifically, and it's in the APPG report, which you can go and download. So the report that came out, what Baroness Meacher, and in fact it was Norman Lamb and one or two other politicians, actually wanted to put forward, was a proposal to move cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2 of the Misuse of Drugs Act. That was the entirety of the proposal. And we were invited to go and talk about that. And we said, what about grow your own? What about, oh, no, we're not ready to talk about that. We're not ready to talk about that. So we needed to make a decision. The decision we made is we went to sit around that table. Within 4 meetings, we'd managed to persuade them that it was nonsensical to just have a new medical policy without allowing patients to actually be able to grow the stuff at home. And that's why when you look at that policy that actually came out, you'll see that the right to grow your own is written into that policy precisely because we were there to influence it. And so, you know, in terms of that, what we support is legal access to cannabis therapeutics for patients, which means we support a patient from England who wants Sativex, rather than in Wales, where we support that patient because that patient wants better access. We also support the patient that wants Bedrocan from Netherlands and is currently going through this crazy import process. We want to support them. We also support the patient that wants to look after themselves and grow their own and benefit from the absolutely beautiful occupational therapy, which is growing your own medicine and then treating yourself with it. Because we want that too. And therefore, any single person who has any kind of medical reason and supports better access to cannabis, that's what UPA stand for. The fact that at the moment, that route is the route that's getting us the most benefit and the most movement, that's just what we face. It's not what we support. We support grow your own and absolutely everything else, absolutely as hard as you guys do.
Any other questions from anyone? All right, so I wanted to talk about that for a brief moment with policy-wise, what's going on in the United States is that the first few states that we had that legalized medicinal use of cannabis legalized it with the right to home grow. That ran from 1996 in California all the way through 2008 in Michigan. From 2010 on, the states that have legalized medical cannabis have either limited or eliminated the right to home grow your own cannabis. And the last 5 states to pass medical cannabis laws have eliminated the right to smoke herb. So basically in those states, you can go to a dispensary and get a cream, an oil, a tincture, a balm, whatever, but no smoking of herb. And so we're facing a cultural backlash that's kind of, in America, it's tied to the cultural backlash against tobacco smoking, where it's just awful, terrible, no, you should never do tobacco smoking. And so an anti-smoking campaign has kind of glommed on to our medical cannabis, where it's taking away from our patients this truly vital means of access. I mean, they talk about vaporization, which is all well and good, but you don't have to recharge a joint. Right? I can take that anywhere. It's simple, it's small, it's cheap. A lot of these patients in America are on fixed incomes from Social Security or whatever. So taking away that right to smoke is difficult. So I'm wondering, is there a similar thing going on with medical here in the UK? Is there an anti-smoking thing going on?
Yeah, well, I mean, I can hopefully answer that. We've got a push in the UK, probably stronger than anywhere else in Europe, to remove tobacco consumption. We've got one of the harshest policies in terms of where you are allowed to use tobacco. And it's thought that any progress in terms of cannabis would probably follow a very similar format. We haven't had the same sort of backlash against the smoking of cannabis here for medical use as you guys have. But I think from what I'm able to understand, a lot of that is simply because of the way in which they want to be able to produce and retail the cannabis. It's a lot easier to do that than just with the dry weight of herbs, which is one of the reasons why it's easier for business to get involved if they're making a cream or a lotion or an edible. We've got quite a growing industry in that market, creams, medibles and so on, but because we haven't got the same laws, the majority of the companies that operate in the UK are currently illegal.
I think, I mean, our approach is, as far as consuming cannabis as a medicine, don't mix it with tobacco. We just can't support that as an activity. But the next approach beyond that is one of helping people towards safer consumption. If they currently smoke it, then I'm sure they're getting the benefits in the way that they need, in the way they want to get it. However, we know that there are better ways of consuming, and therefore if we can make those suggestions, but at the end of the day, the choice is up to the patient.
So is there also, I mean, this is the home of GW Pharmaceuticals, which in the States we talk about them going through FDA trials with Sativex and other products. And we feel, some of us feel, that there's a drive toward the pharmaceuticalization of cannabis. You must be experiencing that here.
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, obviously, you mentioned DW Pharmaceuticals. There's a few other brands of cannabinoid medicines that are available in Europe. But really, I think what it comes down to is it comes down to the financial incentive for the government and the businesses to get involved. So if you look at what's happening in Canada at the moment and the way that they're looking at the possibility of fulfillment there, that's the kind of model that I would think that the British government would be looking at. Rather than looking at small entrepreneurs and small-based industry, what they'd be looking at would be large business to come in, manufacture en masse, and produce pharmaceutical-grade medicines like Sativex, like Apilex. These sorts of drugs have got much more marketable appeal for big business. They can then, once they've got FDA approval, go to America. They're already sold throughout the world. They can already access them throughout the whole of Europe. So that market is only going to grow, and the pressure's going to increase.
Now, yeah. Oh, okay, one last question I had, because I know as much about Brexit as y'all know about the Green Bay Packers. You were saying something about, in your earlier discussion, about how a citizen of the EU could have medical cannabis but a British citizen couldn't. Could you explain that?
For your benefit, Russ, I'll explain it. So part of being part of the EU, or part of being one of the aspects of it, is something that we call the Schengen zone. And effectively, that's a group of nations, countries that have signed up to be able to do lots of things. One of them is freedom of movement. One of them is, part of that is a sub-clause that says, as part of your freedom of movement, my ability to go from here to France to Germany, I'm allowed to take my medication with me and go from border to border to border, rather than have to get a visa or something to enable me to bring on medication. So this universal policy was created called the Schengen Agreement, and what it allows in theory is any European national to take any European medication, as long as they're prescribed it, privately or publicly, and then take that into any other European country. And that works. All the other European countries do it absolutely fine. Back when I was getting involved and talking about it, this is going back 6 or 7 years, there was a big fracas in the Home Office. And what they had was someone who went abroad with a doctor's note, with a prescription, picked up their Bedrocan supply. And Bedrocan, for those that don't know, is the Dutch version of GW Pharmaceuticals that actually grow herbal cannabis. You can just buy skunk, it comes in a little medical pot. They brought it back to the UK. They walked through customs, they declared it, and it was completely legal. Nothing could be done about it. The problem is that then our Home Office passed a law that says, yes, that law applies to everyone except for British nationals. So if you are a French national living in the UK, you can go to France or Germany, Holland, you can get your prescription, you can fly back to England with 60 days supply, and you can bring it through, and you can do weird things, like you can smoke it in a school in a school staff room. You can ask a police officer to shield you, give you a lighter, find you a way to consume your cannabis. There's some really weird things that are tagged onto this, but they don't apply to English nationals. The sad thing is it also applies if you have a property in Europe. So if you're rich and you own a house in France, because you've got a French address or you've got a German address, you can also go to any European country, get your European prescription and bring it back into the UK. It only doesn't work if you're a British national with a British address. And our Home Office did that deliberately. One of the other European nations, I want to say Sweden, it's not. One of the other countries tried to do exactly the same thing. They had a court case about it, and it was found to be illegal. You cannot stop European nationals. And it's thought that if we pushed the same here, and we mounted 50, 60 grand for an appeal, we could overturn that law in the Home Office, because it's not European law. But this feeds into what you were saying in Brexit. So that's the situation at the moment. The problem that we've got is if we go through with what they're calling a hard Brexit, as I'm sure you've heard, that will mean that the Schengen Agreement will no longer apply, freedom of movement will no longer apply, and in theory, people over here that already get their medication, or people that have moved abroad, because quite a lot of Brits want to move to Spain or Holland because you have ready access to cannabis and they can buy their own, they will no longer be able to benefit from that. So if you've got a British expat that's living in Europe that has the medicine, they'll no longer be able to visit their relations in England with the medicine. You've got people that go from Britain and then bring it back in. They won't be able to do that either. So it really is a backward step.
Stu, can I
Sorry,
actually
John.
can I actually add something to that? In terms of Brexit, there's another direct impact in some of the things that I've been looking at as well, because in the last year I've been getting much more involved in the law in the hemp industry. And obviously the hemp side of the law doesn't match up with the cannabis side of the law, and so there's all sorts of gaps in the middle, which an entire CBD industry is being created in. And for the time being, most of it's not illegal, so it's fine. But there are some stipulations within EU law at the moment, and it's been written by EU law about a human rights access to traditional medications that are therapeutic. And actually, our Misuse of Drugs Act, if our government are forced into looking at the Misuse of Drugs Act and changing it at the moment, they will have to refer to that European law, and it will immediately make growing cannabis completely legal. They will not be allowed to put a law in its place because of that European law. Once we Brexit, that's no longer there. The UK government can do what the hell it likes again.
All right, thank you very much. Oh, one last word from Stuart. One last word from Stuart. Were you going to say something?
I'm fine.
No, all right, thanks very much, everybody.